Good morning. Please turn with me to Psalm 104, as you've already heard, as we consider the subject this morning. Good morning. Thank you. The subject this morning, Super Bowl. Okay, I'm lying. Sorry. Just kidding. But we're talking about boundaries this morning, and you're wise to understand your boundaries, even if they are not official. So we don't want to conform the time we spend with God to the Super Bowl, but you need to know your practical boundaries in life as well. As we talk about the subject this morning, abundantly from Psalm 104. Why abundantly? Well, in life, there are times when, from time to time, I'm sure you're going to talk to people who do believe in God to various degrees, but they may not necessarily believe in the God of the Bible. Why? Because there are times in life where if we even buy into the thought of his boundaries, once we buy into his boundaries, we start to realize, oh, wait a minute, there's some things that we have to sort out in life that he has not necessarily told us exactly what to do about. And so from time to time, when I'm talking to people who don't believe, one of the things that they will point out is, okay, well, what are we supposed to do about X, Y, and Z? And there's a list of things the Bible doesn't talk about that they will use to kind of challenge the concept of, okay, well, is the word sufficient for me to practically live my life? And so in order for it to be sufficient, one of the things we have to do is kind of embrace the truth. It doesn't tell me what to do about all that's important for me to get done. But maybe it gives us some principles that can help us make wise choices. And I think that is what the psalmist is getting at in Psalm 104, where it's roughly going to break down in 3 sections. Once again, when I break them down in sections, this is not the word of God. This is just the way I think about it right now. Catch me in a year. Maybe I will find it organized differently. But right now, the first 4 verses that our brother read, verses 1 through 4, seem to talk about God himself, right? And between that, there's going to be a large section that's going to talk about the earth. And it may break down into a third section, I'm not sure, but I'll call it a third section, where the psalmist is then going to turn to himself. And in light of everything he has understood about God and the way that God has interacted with the earth, okay, who should I be? A question we often ask at the end of these lessons. Who should I be understanding what I see about what God has done on the earth? Beginning at verse 1. Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord my God, you are very great. You are clothed with splendor and majesty, covering yourself with light as with a garment. Stretching out the heavens like a tent, he lays the beams of his chambers on the waters. He makes the clouds his chariot. He rides on the wings of the wind. He makes his messengers winds and his ministers flaming fire. And organization is the thing that stood out to me over and over again. Why? Because God, in talking about himself or being described by the psalmist, he's going to talk about a number of things. One, first of all, in verse 1, God is great. But in the second part of the verse, he's talking about, well, how is he clothed? He's clothed in splendor and majesty. Verse 2, covering yourself with light as with a garment. But beyond that, he's going to talk about, okay, how or where does God dwell? Verse 3, he lays the beams of his chambers on the water. And then finally, his administration. That's going to be more important for what we're actually talking about. How does he administer his justice or his rule on the earth? I was going to say he makes his messengers winds and his ministers flames of fire. Something you'll see in Hebrews when Jesus, or the Hebrew writer is describing something that our brother mentioned. As great as the angels, as great as the angels might be, they are not justifiably worshipped, but Christ is. And so understanding that Christ was around from the very foundations of the earth, the next few verses are going to help us understand a little bit more about the way that God has also not only established order in his realm, but order, essentially on the earth. Verse 5, he set the earth on its foundations so that it should never be moved. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they took flight. The mountains rose. The valleys sank to the place that you appointed for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass, so that they may not again cover the earth. But that's not the last time you're going to hear about a boundary, even though that's the last time he's literally going to use that term, at least in the ESV. He's going to go on, if we skip verses 10 through 15, he's going to talk about the way he's established boundaries for dwelling places in verses 16 through 18. The trees of the Lord are watered abundantly. The cedars of Lebanon that he planted. In them the birds build their nests. The stork has her home in the fir trees. The high mountains are for the wild goats, and the rocks are a refuge for the rock badgers. And one of the things I started to realize is as he's going through all of these definitions of where folks are going to live, he's not simply talking about order, but he's talking about provision. Because if you back up to the verses I skipped, he's going to talk about how God has provided for the things that he has set on the earth. Verse 10, you make springs gush forth in the valleys. They flow between the hills. They give drink to every beast of the field. The wild donkeys quench their thirst. Beside them, the birds of the heavens dwell. They sing among the branches. From your lofty abode, you water the mountains. The earth is satisfied with the fruit of your work. You cause the grass to grow for the livestock and the plants for man to cultivate, that he may bring forth food from the earth, and wine to gladden the heart of man, oil to make his face shine, and bread to strengthen man's heart. And the thing that started clicking with me over and over with that whole concept of provision is he wasn't simply providing just enough to get by. And all of those things, whether or not he's providing, go back to verse 13. Verse 13, from your abode, the earth is satisfied. That's talking about the creation. Talks about in verse 13, as we mentioned, you skip over this, he's probably drunk when he wrote this, but he said, wine to gladden the hearts of man. Don't focus on the wine as much as the reaction. And not just a face, but he's provided what's necessary for a man to have a face that glows. We've talked about before. There's a difference between simply existing and having the trappings of joy in your life. And he is not simply giving a provision for us to exist. He's providing for us in abundance. And why does that matter? Because there are times we talk about in the daily grind of life, sometimes I can get so wrapped up in the scarcity of life that I can start to believe that the scarcity is the point. But sometimes it's important to go back to the beginning of the story to understand how God created it so that we can understand why we are dealing with either the adversity or the moments of joy that we have. Understanding that even beyond that, when we have a situation, like if you go back to the story of Abraham, oh great, Marcus, you're talking about abundance. Are we starting to go off into prosperity gospels? Hopefully not. But understand the way that boundaries work in relationship with provision. Because even though Abraham had a lot, he had so much that without the proper boundaries, what he had created conflict. And so in this psalm, what you're seeing is the way in which God has helped us to understand. And I can give you a whole lot, but if you don't have the proper boundaries, all it can potentially do is draw you back into conflict with one another. And so now go back and look at those verses that we read in verses 16 and 18 and understand, for even the animals, he has a place where the birds can fly freely without bumping into the mountain goats or the rock badgers or et cetera, et cetera. So he's not simply giving to them abundantly, he's given them room to enjoy what Abraham and Lot realized that they lacked if they did not have proper boundaries. I need room to move, right? And so that's one of the things that it seems that the psalmist is touching on here as we continue to go on. He's not just talking about the physical place. He's going to talk about seasons beyond the physical space. There are simply times in life, as we mentioned, from time to time, that it's just good to prepare and to work hard. But there are also times, like we said, we don't necessarily honor the Sabbath anymore. But from time to time, I'll say, if you don't take rest, rest will take you. Because you can only work so long before you need a break, right? And so he's going to talk about seasons, the boundaries he's placed on seasons, beginning in verse 19. He made the moon to mark the seasons, the sun to know its time for setting. You make darkness and it is night. When all the beasts of the forest creep about, the young lions roar for their prey, seeking their food from God. When the sun rises, they steal away and they lie down in their dens. Man goes out to work and to his labor until the evening. Why? Quitting time. Love being here. Thank you all for the environment and the welcome, and as I mentioned from time to time, the encouragement. But we all, be a little odd if I just spent all my time here. Just slept here. Yes, I just want to work that hard. I could try to put on that front, but everybody knows at some point we all need a rest, right? And so that's a part of it. When he's talking about these seasons, he's talking about the natural order that God has placed on. Okay, it's time to knock off now, bud. Because at a certain point, I was just sitting there thinking this morning as I was hearing the men speak and hearing us all sing together. There are certain points where, I can't lie, today I was tempted while I was taking the Lord's Supper to go back in my points over and over again to make sure I had them in order. And I just drew a complete blank while I'm sitting there in front. 5 minutes earlier, everything was clear. But for some reason, during the Lord's Supper, it seemed like God was telling me, just take a break, bud, and focus on what we're here to do at this time, at this point, at this moment. And understand in your life, there are going to be times when you're going to want to work through. Come from an industry where we often work through lunch. That's cool. But at a certain point, your mind's going to check out, even if you're trying to push through the boundaries of time that are natural in who we are in our DNA. So understand the way that God's put boundaries on seasons and on our ability, the time we need to rest and the time we need to go forward as well. Verse 24 is where hopefully I began to see the connection between the thing that the psalmist observed about God and the thing that he wants most for himself by the time we get to the end. Verse 24, O Lord, how manifold are your works. In wisdom have you made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. As he goes on to talk about the boundaries of the seas in verse 25. Here is the sea, great and wide, which teems with creatures innumerable, living things both small and great. There go the ships. And Leviathan, which you formed to play in it, to linger in misery? No, even Leviathan, he's saying. That menacing creature, if you realize what the scriptures say about Leviathan and other points, Job is talking about when God is helping Job to wake up and sober up and say, no matter how bad you've had it, Job, you don't understand things like Leviathan, the menacing sea creature. God, once again, didn't create him to be menacing. He created him to play. And so when we're looking at this whole concept of abundance, once again, when we see even those difficult, puzzling times in life where we just kind of scratch our head and wonder why, go back to the point. Because oftentimes that is where my faith will begin to get me through question mark periods of my life. If I can realize that even things as menacing as Leviathan were created for abundance and joy, then all of a sudden life stops being quite as scary as it otherwise might be if I have an anchor in understanding why God created even the most menacing things that I might face. So he'll go on to talk about provisions again in verse 27. These all look to you to give them their food in due season. When you give it to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they are filled with, once again, just enough? No, good things, right? When you hide your face, they are dismayed. When you take away their breath, they die and return to their dust. When you send forth your spirit, they are created and you renew the face of the ground. May the glory of the Lord endure forever. May the Lord rejoice in his works. Who looks on the earth and it trembles. Who touches the mountains and they smoke. The thing that caught my attention maybe most is the difference between the times even within his abundance. God uses scarcity to get our attention. Why? Because back in verse 29 is one of the reasons why it's not the prosperity gospel. Because if you keep reading for very long, you get nuance. And in this one, there's nuance. So he created it in abundance, but it says, okay, in verse 29, when you hide your face, they are dismayed. And even worse, when you take away their breath, they die. That's kind of, if we're going to talk about the Super Bowl, I want to talk about that today, right? That's a part of the reality of life, right? And so it got me to thinking, okay, well, why does God take the time to give us all this abundance? And it's one thing if you say Satan's the one that's taking it away. But what about it when it really is God? And we know Satan's not all-powerful. God is. And so ultimately when the bad's happening to me, at the very least, it's happening on his watch. And so why? Well, it made me think of times like we mentioned before. Jesus, his very own son. Without sin, he came as royalty? No, he didn't come in abundance. He existed in abundance, left the abundance to come and basically suffer deprivation. And we go back to other servants like Moses. Moses had it all. All he had to do is just shut up, Moses, be rich. Moses is like, that's cool, but I got friends who are suffering, right? And so he understood, like we talk about, the beauty of having, the perspective of from time to time when Brother Barry and I get to talk. He gets to give me insight on what it's like to first of all, have wisdom of years, right? And sometimes I'm mentioning probably a little bit too much because we get to talk during the week. And while I'm commuting, I'm not here as much. But the other perspective he gives me is one that takes me back to times when I was on the mission field. And I appreciate times like being, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but an American in an otherwise uh, poor place. And so I might not have ever understood what it was like to have means until I went to a place where people were really living on $1 or $2 a day. And so now I got to understand what it was like to be rich, and I could never understand it. And it gave me respect when I started to meet people who handled their resources well. Oh, wait a minute. So then I started reading the story of Moses differently. Then I started to realize, oh, wait a minute, maybe this is why he took his son Jesus and put him through some things. And ultimately, when we look at David, David is one of those who actually seemed to start out as the runt of the litter, brought through difficulty before but understand, once again, the deprivation was never the point. The abundance was the point. But he brought his strong people through periods of deprivation so they know how to understand compassion and sympathy once they got it. The abundance was always the point. The point of the deprivation, the seasons of denial, was simply to help us understand how to use it. Look at it from a military perspective. I'm gonna apologize to the Pullman folks again. I haven't done that in a couple weeks. But from time to time, I mention the Navy SEALs. When you listen to stories about BUDS, basic underwater demolition, what they go through in training, described as, I can say it's in the Bible, Hell Week, right? Do people look up those stories because they're sleeping in hotels, they're having fun, tents, camping out? No, they're prolonged periods of deprivation because the U.S. military hates them. No, because they're considered some of the best that the U.S. military has to offer. And so if even the U.S. military is putting its best through periods of deprivation, maybe even though it's a secular institution, they are understanding some godly things, some principles about the way he uses not only abundance, but deprivation to teach those he trusts how to handle abundance. And so that's why I appreciate my relationship with people who seem to use it responsibly. Because yes, I have stories in the Bible. That's awesome because it is the Word of God. But one of the reasons why he commands us to come together as a body is because he is continuing to give us living, breathing examples of the things written in this Word, insofar as we are truly his. I heard a brother mention it before. I prefer the term disciples to Christians. I'll say it was Mark. You can pick. Bible uses both. But there's a reason why there's not just one term. A disciple is someone who is following so closely that that's a life worth emulating, right? Set apart from just a student. Like, I can talk to y'all. Y'all can leave. Y'all don't see me most of the week because I'm commuting. But the value in building relationship is, God willing, forming the kind of relationship in which, like we talked about before, you can start to see some examples of what to do. And okay, Marcus isn't perfect, and some examples of just fess up, like I said before, right? The mirror is an essential tool in Christianity because you need to see how people walk it out right and how they fix it when they don't get it right. And so what we're seeing in this psalm is a psalm where the psalmist is seeming to me, talk about this whole concept of, wait a minute, God doesn't simply use abundance. He uses deprivation to sometimes condition those he loves to be even more ready and impressive in the roles that he has designated for them. Verse 33. How do we know? I could be making this up, but these are the verses that lead me to believe that way, because he says, as to himself, no longer talking so much about just the things that God has done generally on the earth. I will sing to the Lord as long as I live. I will sing praise to my God while I have being. May my meditation be pleasing to him, for I rejoice in the Lord. Let sinners be consumed from the earth, and let the wicked be no more. Blessed be the Lord, O my soul. praise the Lord. And the last set of boundaries that I saw being established here, beyond the boundaries of what exists where on the earth, and the boundaries of what dwells where on the earth, and the boundaries of time, when we rest and when we work, and beyond that, how we just exist, using our days wisely, and the boundaries of the seas. The last boundary he seemed to set was, we could all probably say it's right and wrong, right? Because one of the ways he seems to use that abundance and that scarcity is beyond preparing us for good times, is when there are situations where God has to step in. Because in life, like we said before, I appreciate it in my short time, the degree to which I've seen people working towards unity here. But one of the reasons why that's easy to appreciate in certain environments is because it just happens everywhere naturally, right? We're all just getting along just great without God. No, we're not, right? And so when you see people moving together in unity, it's impressive because that's not normal. Thus, you will know them by the love they have for one another. You know a tree by its fruit, but yeah, you'll know them by their love. And part of love is reconciliation, right? And so when you see him setting boundaries here, there are times when God says, okay, if you can't work it out, I have to step in. And so there are times when he uses deprivation to say, okay, as long as you're eating good, you're still going to be making other people miserable in areas where I have not necessarily designated for them to be miserable. And so in order to, we use the example of the playground bully in the young adults class, right? This whole concept of how the playground bully can sometimes illustrate that concept of lawlessness as we see it coming up in the Word. He says, if I see you doing too much in wielding power without understanding the way that you're affecting the people around you, I have to step in. And there are times when he says, I will cut off supply. So you turn your attention, Saul, away from David and back to the Philistines. And so understand how we have biblical examples of how no matter how many times Saul was forgiven, he was still going to hunt David down. But it wasn't until one of those times the messenger came, oh, the Philistines, Saul, the Philistines, that he turned around and went another way. It wasn't the only time. Back in the era of the kings, there was one king that was going to siege or had laid siege to Israel. And the only way they got him to go away, there are many ways in which God goes about accomplishing his purpose, is, oh, wait a minute, you got an even bigger enemy over here. So he deprived that king of the peace that king would have otherwise enjoyed if he wasn't depriving God's people of their peace. And so understand there are times beyond just discipline trying to make us a better individual, is if we stop listening to his appeals for us to simply be more kind, more compassionate, more, oh, wait a minute, because kind and compassionate doesn't always work, but just more like him. See, it's easy if I can offer just a one-size-fits-all answer. Just be nice all the time, right? Yeah. How's that work in prisons, bro? No. You got to have the wisdom to understand when to hit the gas, when to pull off, when to hit the brake, not only driving our cars, but in life. And so it is complicated. And so one of the reasons I believe that God has not given us easy answers that we can simply read and apply is part of what he's doing, as I've probably said from time to time, is he's guiding us into the kind of mind and heart that naturally gains the wisdom that the psalmist says. What do you notice about God? In verse 24, O Lord, how manifold are your works. In wisdom have you made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. And so he's not simply talking about creation. Creation is just one of the ways in which we see the wisdom with which God has not only provided us stuff, but stuff structured in a way that's designed to give us peace. But here's the problem. Because he has given me freedom to make choices, I get to add rules too. Don't you love that? Wouldn't everybody want to live under Marcus's rules? You don't? No? Okay. No matter how well things are going, if you think it out, I don't think there are any of us who are going to do a great job of making perfect laws, but we still have to make them because, like we said, the Bible doesn't give us or spell out everything that we need to do. So how do we go about making rules that are consistent with the purposes that God has designed to create abundance and peace? Well, I can't answer that quickly, but I do know one of the reasons why I like this psalm is because the psalmist reaches out to something that I've often quoted from James. If any of you lacks wisdom, the answer is yes. We all lack wisdom. And so when I am moving forward, realizing that not only do I have a responsibility, even if I'm not elected to any office whatsoever, um, I try not to reuse illustrations. Because I got to plan out what I'm going to say in the little 5-minute lessons, and then I got to plan what I'm going to, and so just talking, God will give me something else, right? Okay. One of my favorite coworkers was a coworker who had to train me in at one point, who he wasn't an official part of management, but he had been there so long, he was a respected member of management, so much so they said, Marcus, just go learn from him. And so from time to time, in addition to the company handbook, he would make up some rules. But for whatever reason, I still liked him, even though the rules weren't always. But here's the thing, he was flexible. And so he understood that we can't function unless I can create some rules in addition to the company handbook, because the company handbook doesn't tell you how to work this machine. And so I'm going to have to give you my wisdom. But I'm going to also have to understand times in which ultimately I got to measure, oh, wait a minute, my wisdom doesn't work in every circumstance. And that was the reason why he was typically always really a joy to work with. Go to church? No, he didn't go to church anymore. We talked about it from time to time. But there are things in your friends and work that when you're talking about the whole concept of evangelism, sometimes start with the light that you still see in them. The things that they don't argue about from God. See, the saying goes, there's even honor, or a certain level of honor that's necessary between thieves. Because if we're going out to steal stuff, hypothetically, brother, at some point we all got to have different roles. And there's a lot of conflict that comes between thieves who decide, oh, wait a minute, that's a much larger share if I don't have to divide it amongst everybody who helped out. And so even in issues or times when we're doing a little shady business, there's a certain level of honor you got to have. And so ultimately that's what we're talking about here. Even people who don't agree, the Bible, I don't know. There's some place where they still appeal or believe in biblical principles. And so when you're talking to your friends, maybe start there. Maybe don't start debating them on the things you disagree about. Start with the things they've already bought into, because something in life is going to be more persuasive than what our words can be. And guess what? What can be more persuasive than words? Deprivation. So sometimes God has already opened the door for the evangelism through the difficult times that he has brought your friends through already. And so you don't know whether or not you're going to be able to persuade them. We're thankful for our brother who was just baptized again. But all you know is you can possibly move things forward as much as you can, hoping to appeal to places where their hearts are already open to what God might be willing to say to them. And so in this psalmist, when I see the psalmist going on to that whole point of the wisdom of God, in chapter 104, verse 33, I will sing to the Lord as long as I live. I will sing praise to my God while I have being. May my meditation be pleasing to him. To him for I rejoice in the Lord. Please go back with me to Psalm 19. Psalm 19. It was super similar to something I saw at the end of Psalm 19. Starting in verse 7, it talks about the law of the Lord is perfect. Times in my life I couldn't have related to that. I was like, the law of the Lord seems like it's killing all my joy. However, once you start to realize the value and the wisdom that the law of the Lord contains, then all of a sudden verse 12 started to make a whole lot more sense to me. Who can discern his errors? Declare me innocent from hidden faults. Keep back your servant also from presumptuous sins. Let them not have dominion over me. Then I shall be blameless and innocent of great transgression. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. I don't know if it's the same psalmist. Probably not, because that's David. But you got two different psalmists who are on the same page, understanding there are certain parts of my life where I'm going to have to make some choices. I can't do that anymore. God, please make the things that I'm meditating on, the things I appreciate. So I often hear the brothers here pray God, help guide us to understand what it is you want us to do with this, and then fill in the blank. The psalmist seems to have the same mindset as David. It says, okay, with these choices that I have to make, Lord, please guide us to help me understand how I need to go about fill in the blank. And in this particular chapter, Psalm 104, the thing that the psalmist is particularly understanding that God has wisdom on is understanding how, we talked about it before because the Psalms mentioned it before, how to set effective boundaries, understanding that there are times I can set up boundaries. We'll finish up in Ezekiel 13. This is a place where, God willing, apart from when I'm at my best, when I am in a time when I am listening to God and having him help me understand what it is that I need to be doing, to help give me the wisdom that fills in the gaps of what the Bible is literally telling me to do. Sometimes it is the negative reinforcement. I need to hear about what the alternative is to what ideally I think I'd like to do in my best. God willing, when folks may ask you for advice, and it actually makes sense, right? Well, this is an alternative. In chapter 13 of Ezekiel, he's talking about, his false prophets. See, sometimes I want to put myself in the hero seat. One of instructors, Brother Barry and I have in common, or one of his friends, one of my instructors, Ron Bontrager from Sunset School of Preaching, said, be careful making yourself the hero of your own story. And I talk about that from time to time because sometimes I need to put myself in the perspective of, okay, Marcus, what happens if you begin to start taking on some of the characteristics of the false prophets? This point in verse 20, he's talking about, after he's gone through the list of false prophets he's rebuking, he's talking about the daughters of Israel, but it applies to everyone. Therefore, in verse 20, thus says the Lord God, behold, I am against your magic bands with which you hunt souls like birds. I will tear them from your arms, and I will let the souls whom you hunt go free, the souls like birds. Your veils also I will tear off and deliver my people out of your hand, and they shall be no more in your hand as prey. And you shall know that I am the Lord. Because you have, and this is the part that caught my attention, because you have disheartened the righteous falsely, though I have not grieved him, and you have encouraged the wicked, that he should not turn from his evil way to save his life. Therefore you shall no more see false visions nor practice divination. I will deliver my people out of your hand, and you shall know that I am the Lord. And the thing I began to realize as I read that verse is there are times whenever I'm writing my rules or I'm establishing things that I think would be good ideas, they're always going to be limited to my perspective. And here's the thing. They have the potential to do a whole lot of good. But on the other hand, the burden of the cross is heavy enough without Marcus's rules added to them, right? And so ultimately what I realize when I read this verse is I can simply say, oh yeah, he's just talking to the ladies here. It's the female prophets. No, Marcus, he's talking to you. Because I don't understand, as I've said before, your perspective. And so there are some things that seem real great for me to add to God's words from my perspective that are simply going to make your life more difficult. And so part of the thing beyond understanding that I need God's wisdom is helping, God willing, for him to keep me sensitive to the way that my thoughts, my opinions, and my perspectives might carve out a great space for Marcus, but might make your walk more difficult. And so we talked about it before. It's like reading that counterfeit bill. This is one of those counterfeit bill passages for me. I don't know if the story is true, but I had someone explain to me before. The whole concept of understanding how to see a counterfeit, as they might be taught by the feds, is you don't sit up and study every iteration of American currency that you can learn. You study the genuine article so much that you're naturally in tune to say, wait a minute, there's something that's just not right about this bill. And even if you don't know right away what's wrong, you have your senses trained to look a little bit closer. And so ultimately, when we're looking at these passages about asking God to give us the wisdom, God willing, one of my first steps is, God, make it intuitive for me to understand that every time I'm offering, quote unquote, my opinion, my illustration, my addition to what you've actually said, it may be creating space in one area, but wherever I'm creating space, I may likewise be burdening someone you never intended to burden. And so as we go into the Super Bowl, we still brought it back, sorry. Ultimately, this represents a time of freedom, right? I talked to Titus not too long ago. I hate to break the news to you, but it's rigged. Don't, no, I'm joking. That's just my excuse anytime my team loses. You get your own, right? But this is a season where we tend to enjoy abundance. And so that's one of the reasons why maybe that title stood out to me, because it helped me understand the way in which God, as we talked about really last week, I think sometimes the times when he might be at his happiest, we can't bless God. We can't give him a Christmas gift. But sometimes we can just give him the peace that comes when we're just happy and getting along and living in abundance and realizing that to the degree he sees us happy, he's given us enough rules to get us there. And one of the reasons why I appreciate the elders and churches that are committed, because I've come from churches that don't necessarily have elders, but to the degree people are still committed to trying to make sure that they are taking care of the body. It's not an easy job, right? And beyond the leadership, I think they'll be the first to tell you they can't do a whole lot without, like I mentioned, some of the love that I've seen, even in potentially difficult times, you all return. And so from that perspective, when we're looking at that whole concept of making rules, it's going to be difficult to guide if you don't make any rules at all. But it's also important to see the appreciation that people have when they realize, okay, sometimes all the rules, they might not always fall in the right places. However, oh, wait a minute, God willing, the rules are designed to, God willing, lead us all into a greater abundance. And like the word says, if we can appreciate the purpose behind the guidance and the rules, it's like it says, love covers a multitude. You got it? Multitude of sins. I'll say it just because I got the microphone, but you finished it. Right? And so, God willing, that's where we begin to have a greater trust. And then that wisdom with God can just perfect it. And so this is a time where if you realize whether or not you are in God, here's the thing. In God, we are still going to struggle to draw the lines in the right places. But outside of God, there's a level of wisdom that we are simply never going to be able to access. And we're going to be stuck trying to figure it out on our own. Of course, God will guide you, but it's not the same way, unless you believe that there's no value in the Holy Spirit, as you will be able to have guidance if he is actually living in you, helping to train your senses to naturally understand right from wrong. And so at times when we offer the invitation, it's asking you to stop struggling to figure out life on your own and accept the invitation that God is offering you to help you stop struggling to figure out situations that are way bigger than you on your own, as we together stand and sing. Way